Stanford University.
Who were not here last week, I'm Stephen Dow. I'm a postdoc in the HCI group. And if you're taking this class for credit, we ask that you try to attend all the lectures. The lectures are online on the website, cs547.stanford.edu. And if you have to miss a lecture or two, you can watch the lectures online. We ask, if you're taking it for credit, to send me and Pao an email at the end of the quarter stating which ones you watched online. The instructions are on the website. Unfortunately, David Wynn's talk from last week will not be online, will not be available. So if you missed that talk, that can still count as one of your 2 missed lectures. A couple of other announcements. This coming Monday is Crowd Conference. It's the conference on everything about crowdsourcing. And right now they're offering $20 tickets for students in HCI. And the conference is in San Francisco. So if you want one of those discounted tickets, you can talk to Pao, who has the information on how to get that. Another announcement, next Wednesday, the Computer Forum will hold a career fair between 11 and 6, just outside of Hewitt. So I think it's actually outside, not far from Gates, within a stone's throw. Next week we have Jeff Johnson from UI Wizards. Jeff will be talking about his book, Designing with the Mind in Mind, the Psychological Basis for UI Rules. And today we have a wonderful speaker, Robert Sutton, who's a professor in management science and engineering here at Stanford, as well as organizational behavior. And you also have a courtesy appointment in the Stanford Graduate Business School. And Bob has quite an impressive bio, including 5 or 6 books and several paper awards. He was named as one of the 10 B School All-Stars by Business Week. And
even though I don't teach in a business school, I'm a B School or All-Star. You figure that out. Anyway.
And today he's going to be talking about his book, new book, Good Boss, Bad Boss, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Is this thing on? Are we all right? Yeah, it is. Okay. I'm not sure. We okay, Lance? Oh, yes, we are. I hear my voice. Okay. So my name's Bob Sutton. As Stephen said, I'm a professor in management science and engineering. I've been here forever. 26 years, 27 years. I tried to leave a few times unsuccessfully. I went to Berkeley for a year. I'm a Berkeley grad. I'm very loyal to Berkeley. Stanford is a better place to work. So I came back to Stanford. I'm also an organizational psychologist, so you get sort of this weird sort of twist. And I, even after I was a full professor, I kept thinking that some of the engineering school would fire me because, like I'm a psychologist and what am I doing here? But I sort of got used to it. I actually really liked being in the engineering school. And one nice thing about being in the engineering school compared to a business school, I'm a psychologist who is a tenured engineering professor who publishes in management journals. So I'm sort of a confused person. But one thing that is really nice about being in the engineering school that I've come to appreciate over the years is that many times business schools are ambivalent about application and actually taking their ideas and affecting businesses and companies. Even though they teach management classes, they're still ambivalent because they want to be pure and do academic research and only that. And the nice thing about being in the engineering school is engineers seem to have a penchant for doing things that are useful. So I think that I actually fit well here in a weird sort of way because of that. And so I've actually been very happy here. And the approach that I take in this book, and actually almost everything else that I try to do, especially stuff that's written for managerial audiences, which is mostly what I do, or applied audiences, is to try to draw on my background as an academic researcher. I still publish in peer-reviewed journals, and I've done that a lot, and to try to take the ideas and put them in such a form that managers, bosses, engineers can actually use them. So the kind of approach you'll hear is that I'll tell a lot of stories because What is it? Statistics show that people remember stories better than statistics. This is sort of one of those interesting things. So that's from Chip Heath's book, Made to Stick. So I stole that idea. So I will tell stories, but if you did a time and motion study of what I do when I write a book, like the book I'm going to be talking about now, Good Boss, Bad Boss, probably 75% of the time I'm reading peer-reviewed journal articles. That's mostly what I do. But then if I just gave you the results of the peer-reviewed journal articles, you would not be very interested in it for the most of you, because it would put you to sleep. So you're going to hear stories that hopefully are consistent with the weight of the evidence, at least as read by me. And that's also another thing. If you're talking to academics, you could probably have some of my other colleagues who had different beliefs and values or whatever read the same research, and they would come up with much different conclusions. So, and that's something that any academic who doesn't admit that they're biased, I think, is usually lying in any field, no matter how rigorous it is. Okay, so that's one of my value statements. So let me start out and describe how this book, Good Boss, Bad Boss, came about. Stephen said I can swear, so I'm going to swear. So in 2007, I published a book that's called The No Asshole Rule. And so sort of the short background of that book is it kind of got written accidentally. My colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I had spent about 4 or 5 years working on a serious book called Hard Facts, which is an argument for evidence-based management. And but along the way, I kind of got interested in the notion of the no asshole rule, which, by the way, when I first learned about it, when I first got to Stanford, I was in a department which has now been merged out of existence called industrial engineering. And we actually had a no asshole rule, and it worked pretty well, by the way. So I sort of saw this in action, and I wrote a little short thing for the Harvard Business Review on the no asshole rule. I got a deluge of interest, and so I wrote a book, so the book that didn't sell so well took 5 years to write called Hard Facts, and this book took about 6 months to write, the no asshole rule. So in the process, I was just deluged with emails, stories, and so on about people who are jerks in the workplace, people who didn't want to be jerks in the workplace, and on, and I still get them to this day. And in the process of realizing what I was hearing about in these emails and in these conversations, the central figure I kept seeing over and over again was this person called the boss. And it was either people who worked for asshole bosses and wanted to know what to do about it, people who were bosses who didn't want to be jerks. And the other thing that happened, in addition to the fact they were bosses, is as I dug into what was going on there, I realized that people, they wanted more to have a boss who wasn't a jerk. They wanted a boss who was actually competent at it. So in fact, and there's actually a large body of research goes back to studies of pre-industrial tribes and stuff, that the people that we as human beings that we want as leaders, they sort of do two things. One, they're competent in whatever they do, so bringing food in the old days, having knowledge of how to hunt, and now it would be knowledge of organizational strategy or something, and also they're benevolent, they treat people with compassion and respect. And if you sort of go through that definition of a good boss, it's been around forever, and that's the kind of bosses that we want. And so consistent with that, I set out to try to write a book to identify the difference between good bosses and bad bosses and what good bosses do. I also at this point want to emphasize something. Sometimes, because I'm the asshole guy, in fact, the new paperback, the title of the new chapter in the new paperback, The No Asshole Rule, is called On Being the Asshole Guy. There's a whole set of stories there. Sometimes I gravitate to the more negative stories just because they're kind of more interesting. Like I got a great one. Just last week, this is on my blog, woman writes me an email, and she resigned from her job. She was a lawyer, and she tucked her resignation letter in the no asshole rule. So like when I get a story like that, I get really excited. But when you hear too many stories like that, you start thinking, well, most bosses out there are bad. Sort of the good news is that if you look at the current surveys that are coming out, there was one national survey that just came out a few weeks ago, shows about 78% of Americans are actually satisfied with their bosses, view their bosses as sort of competent and care about them. And I also keep track of bullying surveys. A new survey just came out done by Zogby, very good at doing national probability samples and polling. So less than 10% of Americans report that at least as of this moment, they have a boss who is a bully. So it's not like everybody out there is constantly being abused, even though I may sometimes slip into the more negative aspects of things, okay? So forgive me if I do that because it's more entertaining. Okay, so what I want to do is start by sort of setting the stage. Let me start with a point from Jimmy Buffett. Well, I'm older than most of you, so I think he's like a young rocker since he's about my age. But anyways, so in one of his songs, he has this great line, which is, "Some things are still a mystery to me, and other things are much too clear." And that's sort of the philosophy I use when I write, especially for managerial audiences. I look, and again, in my biased perspective, at the peer-reviewed literature, and I focus on things where, at least in my eyes, things are clear, and I stay away from topics where there's incredibly inconsistent studies. So to give you two examples, real quickly, one is, have any of you ever heard of the first mover advantage? You know, so like the first firm in an industry is always going to win. Well, it turns out that the first mover advantage, although a lot of people believe in it, something like 60% of people in surveys believe the first mover advantage. And by the way, the more business school education or management education they have, the more strongly they believe in the first mover advantage. But if you actually look at the literature, and I once spent about 3 weeks reviewing it, and my colleague Chip Heath at the business school, he went through the same exercise independently. It sort of looks like a random scatter plot. That you can't really figure out that, if you will, the timing of the entry into an industry matters not at all. One example that often comes up is Amazon in the book business. So they say, oh, Amazon was first. Well, in fact, Amazon was 7th or 8th in the book business. They just implemented better. So that's something I want to talk about. Another thing is performance evaluations. The question of whether or not performance evaluations are positive or negative, or whether or not there's ways to do them to make them more or less effective, absolutely bewildering. The main thing I could tell you about performance evaluations, I guess, is if you looked at, there's a meta-analysis that came out recently. If it was a drug, if performance evaluations were a drug, they would not receive FDA approval. There's just no way. About half the time they make things better, and about half the time they make things worse. And so I stay away from performance evaluations, and in fact, with one of my colleagues, I teach a lot at the D School. Her name's Deborah Dunn. She was a former executive at HP. We actually worked with some companies to try to improve their performance evaluations. And I would say that about half the time we made things better and half the time we made things worse. So right now, the jury is out on performance evaluations. And maybe the closest we had to a success, although we don't deserve credit for it because he did it independently of us, is he's actually a graduate of actually this group. And you know John Lilly, who's CEO of Mozilla, Firefox fame. He's in the process of stepping down and becoming a venture capitalist, but they don't have a new CEO yet. So John's doing two jobs. He's a venture capitalist and CEO of Mozilla, from what I can tell at the moment. Well, at one point, when we were talking to John a lot about this performance evaluation stuff, he actually got rid of the performance evaluations, which was sort of cool. And so Mozilla, I don't know if they still don't have them, but as of a few months ago, they didn't. They just have a system where the only time you go through something like a formal performance evaluation is if you're doing so badly it looks like you should be fired or demoted, or you're doing so well it looks like you should go up a level in pay. And the way they solve the sort of meritocracy problem is that everybody at the same level in the company gets paid the same amount, which I think takes care of a bunch of problems. I think it's actually a beautiful and brilliant system, which I actually wish that the Stanford Engineering School would do. It would save all sorts of problems. All right, so, but for this, so I could go off on performance evaluations for an hour and a half, but since this book is about the stuff that's too clear to me, if you will, that's what I'm going to focus on. So let me start out with a little, and this is a point that isn't even discussed in the book, but it is important from a mental provisioning standpoint, whether or not you're somebody who has a boss, or is going to have one in the future, or is a boss. It's really important from my perspective to know about the mindset research by Carol Dweck. Have any of you ever had a class from Carol Dweck? She teaches at Stanford in the psychology department. Right, nobody's ever had a class from Carol, so I can talk with reckless abandon and pretend I know what her stuff's about. So essentially, the sort of three-sentence summary of Carol's work, and she's been doing this stuff for a good 30 years, is there's two kinds of people in the world. And there are people who believe that their intelligence, skills, and abilities are fixed. And there are those who believe that their intelligence, skills, and ability are malleable. And when she does surveys in all sorts of populations, it's amazing how pretty consistently people will break into the two camps, and you'll get sort of half of one and half of the other. And what she finds is that to the extent that people believe their abilities are fixed, they tend to try less hard, because if all I have is my God-given, or if you're an atheist, whatever, given gifts, and there's no reason to try too hard. I should never go in a situation where I'm going to fail or be incompetent, because it'll just make me look bad, because I would just be inherently stupid. You wouldn't take as many risks, because it would make you look bad as well. In contrast, people who have the learning mindset are more likely to do stuff that's new. They're more likely to take risks. They'll work harder. Failure doesn't upset them so much. And the other thing that comes out from her research, in fact, there's a company now that has started and is using some of her stuff in education, that it turns out that it's possible to change people from the fixed to the growth mindset. So they've done a bunch of sort of like change stuff with everything from little kids to managers, by the way. And so the reason this stuff is so important is if you're a manager or a boss leading employees, or if you're an employee or just general human being yourself, essentially if you believe you can change, you can change. If you believe you can't change, you won't change. So you might want to think about the assumptions you have about the people you lead, about yourself. And it's one of those things that's very powerful. And at Stanford, it's interesting, because having been through, and I would never say this in a normal talk, but I might as well be indiscreet, but having been through many searches for Stanford faculty members, there's a certain kind of Stanford faculty member who will argue is all that matters is how smart the person is. And I've heard this even in cases where like somebody has like no research record, that they apparently don't work that hard, and they'll say, but he or she is really smart, we should hire him anyways because that's all that matters. Those are, if you believe the fixed versus malleable mindset, those are the worst kind of people, because they just think about how smart they are, but they don't want to work too hard because it might make themselves look bad. So it's one of those things that can be very powerful. I'm just thinking the worst faculty hires I've ever been involved in all sort of fit that category. They're really smart if we can just get them to be productive. Well, I like people who are dumber but work harder, frankly. All right, so let me sort of move on. This is all sort of drum roll and set up, and talk about the central idea that runs through this book, sort of the puzzle that I came across and thought about a lot when I worked on the book, and is a theme that really is sort of attached to almost everything. So there's a saying which some of you may have heard, that it's not all about you. You know, it's sort of like, and it's kind of useful, and even there's a guy named Jack Welch, one of the most famous CEOs in American history, led General Electric. He gave a talk at the Stanford Business School. He told the MBAs, it's not all about you. And that's one of those things that's sort of I would describe it as a useful half-truth. That's the way that I would put it. It's useful in that getting people who are in leadership positions not to be egotistical, narcissistic, self-absorbed maniacs is probably a good thing, but it's probably empirically false. And so here's what happens, and we've got a lot of research that shows this, a lot of peer-reviewed studies. When you put people in positions of power over others, quite reliably, there's this sort of asymmetry of attention effect, or upward attention effect, that essentially shows that people in position of authority, that those below them pay an enormous amount of attention to the little things they do, while at the same time they become increasingly oblivious to the things that their underlings do. So this asymmetry of attention, but when you're in a leadership position, you're sort of like under the microscope. And to make matters better or worse, depending on your perspective, one of the most well-established findings when it comes to leadership, bosses, whatever you want to say, everything from CEOs to first-line supervisors, is once you're in a position of authority over people, you will get more credit and more blame than you deserve for their performance, whether you're the CEO of a company or just the first-line supervisor. And I think it's sort of unfair to pick numbers. There's so many studies, and I have not seen a meta-analysis, but I'll do it anyways, and somebody may argue that I'm wrong, but I think I'm close. Essentially, it looks to me, let's take CEOs. If you take CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, depending on the researcher and the conditions, they have between 5% and 15% of an impact on performance. That seems to be sort of the range. There are, by the way, cynics who will argue they have no effect at all. There's a Nobel Prize winner named Danny Kahneman, pretty smart guy, helped invent the whole idea of behavioral decision making and so on. So Danny is apparently doing a simulation now, and I heard this from one of his co-authors. He's arguing that if you randomly mixed up all the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, you just randomly shifted them, would have no effect on performance. And I think and it's kind of cool he's doing that. I actually don't believe that. And I think if you look at the weight of the evidence that CEOs do matter a little bit. But if you look at the research on credit or blame, it looks to me like a CEO gets somewhere between 35 and 50% of the blame and credit for firm performance. And you could see the way that we talk about this, even with, like, HP just got a new CEO who was at SAP before. Everybody talks like, well, that's all that matters in terms of HP's performance, although there's another bunch of other stuff that's going on. But independently of the reality of research on the relationship between leadership action and performance, the lot in life for a leader is the people that you lead are sort of magnifying and looking at every little move you do, and you're going to get excessive blame and credit for performance. So there's this magnification effect that goes in a lot of different directions. And so that very quickly gets to the point, at least in terms of leading others, that the most effective bosses overcome this potential for oblivion and do a bunch of things to be in tune with the people they lead. So let me start out and talk about what I would describe as the risk that bosses need to overcome. And this is my interesting shoes story. So this was, let's see, early 2009. So some of you aren't young enough to have gone through this, but you may remember in early 2009, at least every company I knew in Silicon Valley, well, except for John Lilly and Mozilla, was doing layoffs. Even Google was doing layoffs. Network appliances, the same week they came out as number one on Fortune's Best Place to Work survey, they did layoffs. So just layoffs everywhere. And so I sort of pulled aside working on this book, and I wrote a Harvard Business Review article that was called On Being a Good Boss in a Bad Economy. So I wrote that, and I started doing some executive education. And after one of these sessions, this guy walks up to me, he was at a project management class, and he says, let me tell you an interesting story about something that happened in my office the other day. What happened was that one of the executive assistants walked up to an executive vice president, and she said to him, "When are the layoffs coming?" And he was like completely shocked because this was a well-kept secret, and he couldn't figure out how she knew. So he admitted, yes, the layoffs are coming, and said, "So how did you know?" And she said, "Well, for you, and that's the picture, it's an interesting shoes day. We've learned that when you look at your shoes, instead of looking us in the eye, that there's going to be some bad news coming." And this was sort of a logical inference. And if you go back to this sort of interesting shoes story, it brings us very quickly, if I remember what's next, to this notion that I sometimes call the toxic tandem, that followers are sort of hyper-focused on those who wield power over them, a lot of evidence to support that, while as there's something about being in a position of power that make people oblivious to those, especially those who have less power than they do. So this is sort of the toxic tandem. And again, to emphasize, it's not like every leader suffers like this to a large fault, but it's a risk, I would argue, that everybody needs to overcome. And just to give you a little advice, when you get in leadership positions, as many of you will be, this being Stanford, the more successful you get, the more likely you are to suffer from this problem of sort of obliviousness. And in fact, this brings us to like research on baboons. It turns out one of the cool things about, this is from anthropological studies of baboons, it turns out that the average, in the average baboon troop, the average member looks at the alpha male every 20 or 30 seconds. So that's sort of power, sort of focus. I'm not going to read this whole slide just because I'll bore you, but there's like a great story from the New York Times. This woman, Linda Hudson, described how she was made a president of a large company before she got to be CEO of BAA Systems. And she went to Nordstrom because it was going to be her first day at work being president of this large company. And so she got a nice scarf, and the salesperson showed her how to tie it in a certain way. And then she discovered, to her amazement, that throughout the week she kept seeing more and more women who had their scarves tied the exact same way. And so at least she noticed that, though. You got to give her credit, because some people wouldn't notice that. But the reason that this sort of oblivion and other problems happen when you put people in a position of power, there's a large literature. Some of you may have heard about some of this. There's probably a couple hundred peer-reviewed studies that touch on this. If you send me an email, I will send you the main review. It's done by Deborah Grunfeld, who's in our School of Business, and Dr. Keltner, who's at the Berkeley Psychology Department. And to give you sort of the oversimplified but reasonably accurate summary of their research, mostly these are laboratory studies, but there's some field studies. essentially when you give people power over others, three things happen pretty reliably. One, they focus more on their own needs and concerns. Two, they focus less attention on the needs of others. And three, they act like the rules don't apply to them. Now, the TV's on, but I don't care. I will only speculate, so this is my opinion. So let's look what just happened to Mark Hurd at Hewlett-Packard, okay? I mean, we don't know exactly what he did, but it clearly had something to do with sex and money. That you can discern from the publicly available record. And the other thing that we know is he was about ready to get offered about a $100 million multi-year contract. And to me, that's the classic time when an executive would be at risk of power poisoning and lose impulse control, because that's what these researchers show over and over again. You give people power, they lose impulse control. And when it comes to the sex thing, men are especially prone to this. This is also very well documented. He was sort of the perfect CEO to sort of lose control. And so that's why I say when you get in a position of authority, especially when things are going great, you should be especially nervous about the fact you're going to turn into an insensitive jerk. So along these lines, and there's lots of studies that support this, but I always pick the most entertaining one, not necessarily the most rigorous. There was a cool study that Deb Grunfeld and Dr. Keltner reported as unpublished except in the Psychological Review in their overall paper. And essentially here was the setup. So what you had was done with UC Berkeley students. You had three students brainstorming over how to solve a social problem, like how do we make the Berkeley campus more green, things like that. But that wasn't, and then the other part of the manipulation is that two of them were brainstormers, sort of the worker bee, and the third one, all randomly assigned, of course, was the boss, the one who was evaluating the quality of their work. And these are just randomly assigned. And the key intervention or manipulation, since we all know that psychologists always lie to you, you know this, right? If you've ever done a psychological experiment, been part of it, and I have a PhD in psychology, we always lie to people. So anyways, but the real manipulation was who took the fourth cookie. Because if you think about it, the fifth cookie is sort of like the norm against it, but the fourth cookie is sort of in play. So what they did was they sort of counted things up. These are careful researchers. So they had this 3-item scale of disinhibited eating. Whether or not the person took the fourth cookie, and so the people in power tended to take it. Whether or not they ate with their mouths open. So they and these are good researchers. They videotaped them. They had independent coders. This was not their, and then whether or not they left more crumbs. So if you go back, focusing on your own needs and concerns, focusing less on the attention of others, and acting like the rules don't apply to you. Although this is a very cute, oops, I went too far, a very cute example, this is the basic sort of effect you have. And it gets less funny when you're talking about things like compensation, by the way, and it's the money you're losing. But I think it's important to sort of remember that this is a risk that especially people in power need to overcome. And to go back to the point I want to emphasize, this doesn't mean this will automatically happen to you when you get in a position of power over others, but I would argue that it's a risk for anybody who wields power over others. And the longer they have power over others, and the bigger the power difference, the more risk they're at. Okay, so that's sort of the overall headline and the theme that really runs through much of this book and much of the research that I've done on bosses and other folks in authority, which is that you're at risk if you're in a position of power of becoming clueless and oblivious to the people you lead. But your success as a leader, especially when it comes to motivating, inspiring, treating people as civilized human beings, depends heavily on being in tune with the people you lead. So there's sort of like this general obstacle that needs to be overcome. So on the more optimistic side, let me focus on some of the research about what in-tune bosses do. One of the first bodies of research, and some of the stuff is done by a guy named Frank Flynn, who teaches at the Stanford Business School. He did it when he was at Columbia, is on assertiveness. So there's sort of the cool body of research that shows that essentially the best bosses are roughly average in terms of assertiveness when you have their followers do ratings. So things like competitive, aggressive, passive, submissive, they're roughly in the middle. And then so Frank Flynn and his co-author Ames, they have this great quote that a perfectly assertive boss is sort of like perfectly salted food. You notice that you don't notice the way it tastes. So I think that's sort of cool. But the other point they emphasize, which I think is especially important and gets to this in-tune thing, is they're not just saying the best bosses are medium assertive at all times. Essentially, the best bosses know when to, if you will, turn up the volume, when to interject, when to criticize people, when to give them direction, when to coach them, and they know when to get out of their way. And to me, that's like the hallmark of a great boss, being in tune. And so the Giants are going to clinch tonight, right? I'm actually going to the Giants game tonight, so I'm very excited. I bought tickets about 3 weeks ago, scalp tickets. It looked expensive. Now they look really cheap. But anyways, so there's somebody who, if you are a San Francisco Giants fan, and many of you perhaps aren't, but who was long hated by Giants fans. This is Tommy Lasorda, who was the manager of the LA Dodgers, kind of a charismatic, funny guy. He still works for the Dodger organization. He's worked for them more than 50 years. But so he had a great quote. The day he took over as manager of the Dodgers, he said, I believe managing is like holding a dove in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, you kill it. But if you hold it too loosely, you lose it. This idea of sort of like being perfectly assertive. So in fact, when we went through the book naming process, I had this great session. We're fine on time. So I had this great session. There's this guy named Mark Hirschhorn I know, who's sort of like a nuts, crazy creative. He does everything from write scripts for like Hallmark TV shows to he's in a stand-up comedian collective, so they submit jokes, and sometimes Jay Leno has told his jokes. But the thing he's most well known, he wrote a book called I Hate People. It's kind of a stupid book, kind of cool. But the thing he's mostly known for is naming stuff. So he's named the BlackBerry and the Swiffer, so pretty good at naming stuff. And so at one point, when I was trying to figure out what to call this book, we sat down at Half Moon Bay, and I gave him the first couple of chapters. And he suggested a bunch of names, and I told him the story, and he said, you should call the book Don't Crush the Bird. So I thought that would make maybe we should have called it Don't Crush the Bird. Anyways, but the key sort of point here, that sort of digression aside, is that you can see sort of this art of being a perfectly assertive. The only way you can figure out when to push people and when to back off, and also, of course, there's individual differences, who to push and who to sort of let go, is by being in tune with the people that you lead. I can't figure out any other way to do it. And how many of you know David Kelly from D-School fame, mechanical engineering? So I've known David, I guess, for 13 or 14 years. It goes back to in the mid-90s with one of my doctoral students. We did an ethnography of IDEO. So I've seen David in action a lot at IDEO, and then now with the D-School, I've been to a lot of meetings with David, too, for the last 15 years. So David does this thing, and I joke, sometimes I call it management by leaving the room instead of management by walking around. And I think I've seen David do this like 50 times. And so what David will do, he'll sort of bring people together and kind of get the meeting started. But David, one thing to his credit, is nice and participative a guy as he is. He's actually pretty aware that his power and status can have some effect because he's like this famous designer and everything. And plus he's busy. But he does this thing where the meeting will start, and then when it's going well, he sort of walks to the back of the room and watches it for a while, and then he leaves. And it's actually, and I've talked to him about it, and part of it is just kind of an impatient sort of guy, but the other part is he's figured out that when he stays there too long, it just gets in the way. And so that's sort of like a little, bit of assertiveness there. And he always says, the worse things are going, the longer I stay in the front and the longer I stay in the back, because I need to interject a little bit. Okay. So also, along these lines, something that's important to know about, since this is Stanford and many of us do and are going to do creative work, is that one of the times when management, so a boss who interjects, who asks questions, who watches people, is especially destructive is when people are doing creative work. And if you think about it, and there's some stuff on sort of social inhibition and social facilitation, some research that goes way back to the 60s, that essentially shows that when people are doing a task that they know very well, and somebody watches them, they do it even better. But when somebody is doing a creative task, what ends up happening, if there's a lot of questions, a lot of interjection, a lot of evaluation, people will become less creative because they'll move to the tried and true. So you've got to be especially careful when you're leading creative work not to interject too much. And the best quote I ever had at this, and to set it up, this was, I'm getting so old I can hardly remember the year, 2002. So I was at Motorola, a company still that is in some struggles, and we're doing this sort of creativity panel, and I was on it with this guy named Bill Coyne. He had just stepped down being head of R&D of 3M for, I guess he was head of R&D for 3M for about 10 or 12 years. And he's first of all, he sort of went on and talked about how a lot of his job was sort of keeping interesting projects going on in R&D away from the senior executives, because they get too curious and interject too much and ask too many questions, like when it's going to market, blah, 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 blah. So he said, and he sort of used, I think the expression he used was, I would show them pretty shiny things, by which he meant really interesting projects that would distract them that he didn't think had much commercial value, and then he wouldn't tell them about the stuff that was going on he thought was going to be really important and make them a lot of money. And so he had this great quote, which is, after you plant a seed in the ground, you don't dig it up every week to see how it's doing. And the impulse, you can laugh, but when you're like leading a creative team, it's really hard to control yourself and not do this. And you know, back to David Kelly, I've known for a long time. You know, that's one of his great skills is that he'll ignore people for long periods of time. He's actually quite good at it. All right, so that's the point about assertiveness or interjection. The next one is something that my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I have been sort of futzing with and struggling over. So I guess it's funny I'm talking about David Kelly more than I usually would. So the first time I thought I was going to do something on wisdom was right after doing the ethnography of IDEO, so this would be like 1999 or something like that. I actually got a book contract to write a book called The Attitude of Wisdom that was inspired by watching David's leadership and other folks who were good at leading creative teams. And I never finished it. I actually gave back the advance, so one of the few advances I've given back. And the thing that comes out of research on leadership and wisdom in particular is, let's start out with leadership. There's this problem, which is, on one hand, and lots of studies support this, that people who rise to power and people who inspire confidence, effort, and so on in others are leaders who act confident in what they're doing, they have the courage to act, they're inspiring, they act like they're in control. And when you ask them, you ask their subordinate, is your boss in charge? Is your boss in control? The answer will be yes. But the negative underbelly of that is when people are in charge and in control, sometimes they believe, if you will, their own bullshit too much. And so it gets harder for them to, if you will, have the humility to avoid turning, or they don't have enough humility, they start turning pig-headed, arrogant, and so on. So if you look at leaders, at least we would argue, and I think there's a fair amount of evidence to support this, who are most effective, essentially they have what some psychologists would call the attitude of wisdom, which is the courage to act on what they know, so they don't keep doing endless analysis and uncertainty, but they also have the humility to doubt their assumptions and actions. So to me, that's one of the hearts of a good leader. And to have that sort of balancing act, especially the wisdom one on the top, again, that sort of requires this ability to be in tune with how you're coming across to others. And just a quote from the famous Andy Grove of Intel fame. I'm just going to read the top because I think it summarizes it. Very good summary of the attitude of wisdom. I think it's very important for you to do two things. Act on your temporary conviction as if it was a real conviction, and when you realize that you are wrong, correct course very quickly. So it's action along with humility. What are some of the things that, if you will, wise bosses do? One thing that they can do is actually listen, not just fake it, as the John Wooden quote says. To give you a contrary example, there's an example in the book that opens chapter 3, the chapter on wisdom, and so I've got to be careful because I'm under NDA, so I can't identify the name of this company, but to obscure it a little bit. So this was, when was this? About 2 years ago, I think that's right. So there's a business school professor, somebody may have known, or at least heard of, named Hage Riva Rao, and we were doing some consulting to, let's say, an unnamed Fortune 500 company. That's close enough. And we were in one of those meetings, and some of you are old enough, but many of you might be too young to have been in an all-day corporate meeting that absolutely sucks. So we were like locked in a conference room in Boston. It just sucked. And the reason that it sucked was there's a guy who we call Roberta in the book, so we changed the name to protect the innocent and the guilty. And this guy, Roberta, stood in front of the room, and so about 14 people in the room. I should give some context. Really smart, really well-educated room. People, and he talked, and he talked, and he talked. And I was sitting next to this woman named Marla, and Marla looks at me and she says, she starts writing, she didn't look at me, she started writing down the PowerPoint decks that he was spewing out, because the company had a lot of PowerPoint decks, and he was just spewing out one after another. And so finally it's about 2 o'clock. We had lunch and everything, and literally if you looked at the faces in the people room, it's like, just think of the worst class you've ever been in your life. That was like the mood in the room. Everybody looked, they were dying. This guy's leaving, so I must have something. Sorry. We're number 3. No, I'm not offended. Anyway, so finally he sits next to me at about 2 o'clock, And he was silent for a while. But he looks at me and he said, so it looks like I'm listening, but I'm not really listening. I'm just reloading. I'm just thinking of what I'm going to say next. Sort of like the perfect boss, and in terms of being a horrible listener, almost a perfect example. But there's also, I think, an important lesson in this, which is, although I could go on and rant how corporate America sucks sometimes, I actually have to give some credit to the people who run this company, which is that his behavior at this meeting got back to him, and he got a talking to, and it looked to me like he kind of got pushed aside a little bit too. So there is sometimes consequences in well-managed firms. There's another thing that anybody in authority needs to be aware of, and I'm going to throw in some other stuff here too, and this is the mum effect. So one of the problems that you have when you're in a position of authority is that the people who work for you have enormous incentive to not tell you the truth. And there's at least two incentives. There's lots of incentives, but the first one, so this is the mum effect, and I'll talk about this a little bit more detail. The mum effect essentially is a body of research that psychologists have come up with that show that when somebody gives you bad news, even though you're not aware of it, it leads you to like them less. So that means if you're unwise, objectively, if it's just your career you're looking out for, to give your boss bad news, let somebody else do it. And even though your boss doesn't realize it. So that's the first part. The other part is some of the research on flattery. And if you want to read about this, there's a great book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. Anybody had the Cialdini book in class? Somebody might, one guy, you should read this book. It's an amazing book. Anyways, so one of the things that Cialdini reports, and there's, again, nice peer-reviewed psychological research that shows this, is there's research that shows that when people flatter us, even when it's false flattery and we know it's false, we still like them more, okay? So you start thinking of the position, your boss is the one who determines your promotion, your pay and stuff. You've got every incentive to not give your boss bad news and to do such severe brown-nosing that you're exaggerating. Oh, you look beautiful today, or you lost weight, or something like that. That stuff works, okay? But then let's go back into the organizational setting, that through the process, like the truth gets, in my reaction is this is just how we are as human beings, and it's like sort of a problem to fight. And one of my favorite cases, and this is back to the mum effect. If you don't know about this, it's one of the great moments in American history. Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, he's put on the, I almost called this the Columbia. Anyhow, so he's put in the Rogers Commission to figure out why the Challenger exploded, the Challenger space shuttle. And Rogers, as head of the commission, kept getting pissed off because Feynman went rogue and was doing things like running around and talking to engineers and folks at NASA, and he was quite upset at him. But one of the things Feynman did, and by the way, Feynman also figured out why the space shuttle exploded too, if you know the story. So he asked a question, and this is something that hasn't happened yet, and I guess the what do you call it, the space shuttle thing's almost over, so maybe it won't happen. He asked him to estimate the probability that the main space shuttle engine would blow up. And I also think of the BP spill in this case, what the numbers would be. The engineers estimated 1 in 200. The senior executives estimated 1 in 100,000. And there's other explanations like the PRBS pressures that senior executives are under, but you sort of wonder what would be the numbers in between. And this is one of those cases where part of the story is certainly that being in a position of power makes you clueless. And there's something going on there that's sort of automatic and cognitive and emotional, part of being a human being. But there's also something about the nature of organizational systems that as things go up the hierarchy, you got to be really careful about the filtering situation. And so if any of you have seen this film Undercover Boss, the TV show, no, this is Stanford, nobody would admit they watch television, I love this. Well, in case, well, you can look it up on the web, but that's sort of like the idea is the CEOs go undercover and see what's really happening, and they're often shocked. So that's one of the things that you as a boss will need to overcome. The other thing that's related to wisdom that good bosses do is that they learn how to lead good fights. And there's a really nice body of research, 50 or so peer-reviewed studies. Eddie Jen used to be at Wharton, did a lot of this research. And essentially what this research shows is that, especially when it comes to creative work, the most effective bosses, the most effective teams sort of create a situation where people fight in an atmosphere of mutual respect. And probably the best summary I ever had of this was, this is from an organizational theorist named Carl Weick, fight as if you're right, listen as if you're wrong. Now, having taught, since you're Stanford students mostly, Stanford students for now 25 or 26 years, as a population, I won't talk to you individually, you are fabulous at fighting as if you're right, But this listening as if you're wrong is not something that comes naturally to many Stanford students because you're all so smart. So, and in fact, in the D school classes we teach, very often this is the struggle when somebody is absolutely sure they're right to get them to listen to the rest of their team. One of the places, and I gave this talk a variation of it last night at Xerox PARC, one of the most famous people in the history of Silicon Valley is a guy named Bob Taylor. So Bob Taylor, give you sort of the short history. So Bob Taylor, he was first at ARPA, and led a bunch of projects that actually led to the invention of the internet, among other things, the ARPANET it was then called. And then he went to Xerox PARC and he was the lab manager of the computer science laboratory. They came up with everything from the Ethernet to the mouse to what you see is what you get to laser printing, an amazing sort of period of invention in American history. And one of the things that Bob Taylor, who was not a technical guy, he was like a psychologist, that he was sort of famous for leading good fights. And so this is a great quote from a book called Dealers of Lightning in which he described what he did. I got them to argue with each other. If there were technical weak spots, they would almost always surface under these conditions. And here's the key sentence. It was not to be personal, impugning a man, and I assume a woman's, thinking was acceptable, but never his character. So to me, that's the definition of constructive conflict. And I love this last sentence. Everyone's ideas were impartially subject to the group's learned demolition, regardless of the proponent's credentials or rank. And if you think about the amount of management skill and trust and so on it takes to actually create these conditions, these are lovely words, but the amount of skill it takes to have this happen is actually very difficult. So to bring us to a more modern leader who's great at leading conflict, first we interviewed him, my colleague Huggy Rao and I interviewed him for the McKinsey Quarterly, and then I've since actually given this talk and other talks at Pixar. And so this is sort of back up. So this is about 2 weeks ago. I gave this talk 3 weeks ago at Pixar. And so to you, I can claim that I know what Brad Bird does, but since a lot of them had worked with them, I put up the slide and they said, so is this right? Is Brad really great about creating a situation where people fight really constructively? And they sort of went on and on and on. And some of the stuff that comes out about Brad Bird that's interesting, oh, by the way, he's the Academy Award-winning director of The Incredibles and Ratatouille, so I should have emphasized that. So anyways, he's also, if you've seen The Incredibles, he also voices Edna. So if you remember, Edna was remember the half German, half Japanese costume designer who hated the capes? So he's actually really fun to interview because he kind of talks, he's like a cartoon character. So anyway, so he's also very beloved at Pixar, but when they brought him in, and this does get to a creative abrasion, so Steve Jobs, Ed Catmull, and John Lasseter brought him in because they were worried that they'd had 3 big hit films in a row. Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2, and A Bug's Life. I just can't, it's such a different way to think than most companies. I think Ed Catmull especially is brilliant about this stuff. And they told him his job was to shake things up. And when we interviewed him, what he told us was he went to HR and he said, bring me your black sheep. I want the people who are here who are ready to leave, who think that everything that Pixar is doing is wrong. And you think about it, they were pretty successful after Toy Story 1 and Toy Story 2 and so on. And then in talking to people who worked with him, especially there's a guy named John Walker who was his producer on 3 different films. John Walker made a statement, something like working with Brad was like being in loving conflict with someone. And I've got to get the video up here somehow. And if you have the Incredibles DVDs, there's extra footage, and there's great footage of Brad Bird being involved in fights. And one of my favorite ones is he's sitting next to John Walker, his producer. So the producer is like the money budget schedule guy. And John Walker is saying, Brad, it's my job to get you across the finish line. And then Brad says, but I want to get across the finish line first. And that conflict, and you can tell they really like each other, that's a pretty creative conflict to have in a team. One other thing that I should emphasize, and I think this goes back to, it's really easy for me to glibly say you should have constructive conflict on your team, blah, blah, blah. So Brad was brought in to be the director, this was before he got to Pixar, of the Iron Giant, which, has anybody seen the Iron Giant? It's a pretty, actually this is a high percentage, you're kind of a nerdy crowd, you would have seen it. But it was a commercially successful film, or it was a great film that was not particularly commercially successful, well reviewed. But he was brought in as sort of a turnaround guy because things were messed up. And when we interviewed, he said, so this was from a speech he gave the first day. He said, I gave this great speech about how we were all going to fight like crazy. Everyone would be humiliated and encouraged together. He said, blah, blah, blah. And so then I started working, and they all stared at me and didn't say a word for weeks. And essentially what he said was they were like abused children because of the prior director who treated them like dirt. So it took several weeks to get their trust. And he said eventually one of them sort of spoke up and said, Brad, you might be wrong. And he said, I really encourage that. And within a couple of months, they had good constructive conflict. But the reason I say that, and you sort of go back to Bob Taylor using this sort of flowery language, that making it safe for people to, if you will, argue as if they're right and listen as if they're wrong is not always an easy thing to do and is a managerial skill that takes a while to learn. Two other things about fighting, and then we'll go on to the next point. Number one, don't fight when you're generating new ideas. In the very early brainstorming phase, like the worst brainstorms I guess I've ever been to in my life, and I've been to some pretty bad ones, are somebody makes one suggestion and then everybody argues about whether it's right or wrong. And then 15 minutes later, somebody makes a second suggestion and everybody argues, and then it's an hour later and you have 4 suggestions and 45 different arguments. It's not constructive. You've got to wait till you get the ideas on the table until you start sort of ripping them apart. And then the sort of Intel model gets at this and a lot of other approaches, which is essentially disagree and then commit. There's a phase when it's constructive to fight, and there's a phase, and this is very hard for many Stanford students, when even though you've lost, you've got to sort of admit defeat and go on and help with the implementation. And here, like the advice that I like to give, and I stole this from someone else, is that if you're in a situation where the group has decided, or your boss has decided, depending on the local authority structure, that you're going to implement an idea that you disagree with, the advice is work especially hard to implement it well. And the reason is that way when it fails, you know it's because it's a bad idea, not a bad implementation. It's very counterintuitive. It'll also be good for your career, because that way when you show up your boss or colleagues as being wrong, you really have the evidence that, that you've done everything you can to implement it. Because what happens in real life is very often it's hard to tell the difference between, if you will, a bad idea and a bad implementation. All right. So let me talk about 2 other major points, and we should have at least a good 10 minutes for comments and questions. The next one has to do with stars in rotten apples. So let me start out, and I'm going to go back to this eliminate the negative question. Let me start out and describe at least, and I guess to back up, this is a puzzle my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I were trying to figure out for a long time. So there's lots of different companies we work with, and that we've also seen in the research literature that have wildly different incentive systems. So on one extreme, you've got something like General Electric, which has huge differences in pay between top performers and bottom performers. On the other hand, you have other sorts of companies, Procter & Gamble, which is a little bit more compressed, and other companies start looking a little bit more like socialism. I don't think it's so true of IDEO now, but in the old days, I used to look at their pay differences. It looked almost like socialism. At one point, David Kelly was not making twice what the receptionist was. That was a long time ago, though. Although he still owned most of the firm, so that helped him in a lot of ways. But in looking at firms that are effective, and I could make an evidence-based argument, by the way, just to pull over for a second, that the more compressed the pay is in an organization, the smaller the difference between the highest paid and lowest paid people. In general, the groups and organizations will be more effective. But that's also sort of murky, but the evidence does sort of look like that. But the thing that has been coming out more and more to Jeff Pfeffer and I, it's been clear to us, is that whether a firm has really spread pay or really compressed pay or different sorts of pay systems, the ones that are most effective, if you will, at turning knowledge into action, at avoiding dysfunctional internal conflict and competition, and a whole bunch of other good things, are ones where a superstar or a star employee is defined not just as somebody who stomps on others on the way to the top, but somebody who helps others succeed along the way. So, and a good example, a well-known firm that sometimes gets bashed and might deserve to, McKinsey, the famous consulting firm, the perspective and definition of just to operate as an employee at McKinsey, consultant of any kind, is you've got to be constructive and help your colleagues succeed. And to give you an example of this, some years back, so about a decade ago, my colleague Jeff Pfeffer and I were writing a book called The Knowing-Doing Gap. And at one point, Jeff went to Sutton University for a company called Men's Warehouse. How many of you know Men's Warehouse? They're on TV a lot. They've got this spokesperson, George Zimmer. He gets on TV, he says, I guarantee it. And it's sort of this, the whole concept of Men's Warehouse, by the way, is a guy walks into a store. There's no women's warehouse. He doesn't want to be there. He wants to get it over as quickly as possible. He doesn't want to look bad, like shit, when he walks out. And he doesn't want to get ripped off. That's kind of the whole model. So you got a customer who doesn't want to be there, and part of the things that they do at Men's Warehouse to make the experience good, in theory, is to have a team selling environment where everybody helps you with the experience, not just the one salesperson who is getting the commission. Well, so inconsistent with a team selling environment, in one of their Seattle stores, they had a guy who was the top salesperson in the Seattle region, but he was undermining the team selling environment. He kept stealing sales from people. So they eventually fired the guy, which was probably a good idea. And the punchline of the story is that within a couple of months, although no individual salesperson reached the stars level, the overall sales in the store went up about 30%. So that to me is like a sign of what a destructive person can do. Okay, so this leads me to the research on bad is stronger than good. And so let me, I guess, start out with an oversimplification, but I think a useful one. It turns out that if you're a boss, again, this is an oversimplification, but I think it's a useful one, is if your choice is to accentuate the positive or eliminate the negative, you should focus on eliminating the negative. It'll pack much more wallop. So to give you some of the evidence, there's this thing called the 5-to-1 rule. One example of the 5-to-1 rule is that, and this is research on interactions at work, that a negative interaction with a coworker or a boss packs 5 times the wallop on your emotional state than a positive one. And moving the 5-to-1 rule in another situation, and this might be the most important thing you hear in this talk, more important than the other stuff, is the 5-to-1 rule also applies to personal relationships, so marriages, your boyfriend or girlfriend, and so on. And the finding is essentially that when things slip below 5-to-1, so for every bad interaction you have, there aren't 5 good ones, you're in trouble. Your relationship is likely to fall apart. So that means, and I apply this to my wife, and who knows, hopefully it'll keep going on, but I've been living with the same woman since she was 19, and I was 21 and I'm 56, so far we're at least hanging in there. And so I've sort of learned that when I screw up, which does happen fairly often, that I have to at least do 5 good things quickly following that. And it's sort of like a good rule you might follow. So the 1-to-1, and guys are especially bad at this, 1-to-1 does not work if you look at this research. All right. So moving this bad is stronger than good stuff to the workplace and to teams, there's some actually interesting research by Will Phelps, that he did some of his own. He also summarized it. And essentially the finding is that when teams have one destructive person, one bad apple, he calls it, I had this person put in this apple, so I got to make sure and do that. Anyways, so essentially what I would label these people as deadbeats, people who don't pull their weight, downers, people kind of depressive, or people who are assholes, who are demeaning to others, that essentially they bring down performance of the team 30 to 40%. And there's 2 reasons that he argues in the Bad is Stronger Than Good article argues about why there's a negative effect. One is a simple contagion effect. There's actually a lot of evidence, especially when it comes to negative emotions and other bad behaviors, that you're likely to catch it from other people. And that's one of my main arguments in the no asshole rule, is the reason you don't want it is it's like a contagious disease. The second reason it has to do with just attention, which is that if you've got one of these difficult characters in your group, you end up spending a lot of time dealing with that person and less time actually focusing on performance. And so there's sort of 2 solutions here, if you will, the basic sort of solutions. One, you try to find some way to fix them, to reform them. If we believe the research, the Carol Dweck research, that if you believe you can fix the person, the odds sort of go up. And if they believe they can change, so there's lots of cases of people being reformed where they start out bad and get better. And then the other approach is there does become let me tell you my Mark Marquez story, since I have time to hear it. So who knows who Mark Marquez is? Somebody has to know who this is. Who is he? The coach of the Stanford baseball team. He's been the coach for more than 30 years. So this is maybe, 15, 16 years ago at least. So we had Mark come to an executive program. I actually since have asked him a bunch of times, but he's always turned us down. So he comes to the executive program, and so one of the executives asks him, so what do you do with a prima donna? You know, in sports, the prima donna problem is sort of like infamous. So what do you do with a prima donna? And so what he says is, he said, well, there's a lie I tell them, which is sort of like, and we can talk about the ethics of whether you should lie to him if you want, but sort of he said, what I tell them is that the professional scouts are impressed with his performance, but they're worried he's a lousy team player. And he said, the reason I tell them that lie is that better they should hear the lie from me than the truth coming through from a coach, and he said it can be very effective, or from a scout, it can be very effective for getting them to change their behavior. So that was sort of his reform strategy for dealing with a rotten apple. I think sort of creative. And again, we could have an ethics conversation about that if you want. And then the other example, and this one I especially love, comes from a firm called Baird. So in early 2008, so remember I wrote a book called The No Asshole Rule. So I'm reading, Fortune magazine publishes a list every year of the best places to work. So I'm reading the list, and there it was then number 39. It says Baird, they're a financial services firm, and it says they tout their no asshole rule. So like, I got a firm that has a no asshole rule and is bragging about it in Fortune magazine, and Fortune's printing it. So I immediately like got in touch with the head of HR, and within a couple weeks, I was on the phone interviewing Paul Purcell, the CEO of the company, and he talked a lot about how the no asshole rule worked, and he said this thing which I just love, which is, during the interview, I tell them that if I discover they're an asshole, I'm going to fire them. So how's that for a screening thing? And what Paul said was, most of the time it has no effect on them, but every now and then they turn pale and I never see them again. So, and the other thing, which is I think more important and brings us full circle to the definition of a superstar or a destructive or undestructive person, is, so I asked him what he meant by an asshole, and what he said was it's somebody who consistently puts his or her own needs ahead of their peers, the company, or customers. And so that's, again, this idea of somebody who is selfish and destructive to the culture. Okay, so that's the rotten apple point. I have 5 minutes?
Yep.
What time does this thing end?
If you want 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, we might have like 7 minutes. Okay, but I'll move quickly. So serve as a human shield. One of the last points, and this is my last major point, thanks, Stephen, is that when you look at surveys and you ask people, like, what's the definition of a great or lousy boss, one of the things that comes through over and over again is the notion that he or she has got my back or not got my back. And what that means, to be a little bit more specific, is the best bosses protect their people from harm, indignities, idiocy of all kinds, and so on. Sometimes what that means is that they just see visitors, as the Mintzberg quote suggests, a nice quote, that someone defined a manager half in jest as someone who sees visitors so everyone else can get their work done. That's one managerial function. In this one, I'll go through quickly. Sometimes it means that they run meetings in such a way that they treat people with respect, they respect their time. A good example is, I love this, this was from a New York Times article, Will Wright of Sims fame. There was one guy, and I love this guy's name, Ocean Quigley. Talk about a great name to go through life with. So anyhow, Ocean Quigley was sort of famous for being impatient, and so Will Wright he called this employee-centered method, that when Ocean Quigley raised his hand and wanted to be excused, that was a sign the meeting should be over. That's sort of like a cute way to do it. And he also did this thing where he charged people $1 every time they called the meeting to get them to think about it. So meetings are one place you see this. And finally, and this is a sad but true thing about organizational life, the fact is that even in the best ran of organizations, there are sometimes situations where idiocy rains down from on high, and a good boss has to find some way to protect his or her people from such idiocy. And my favorite example, and this was pretty severe idiocy, was, so this is when I was a new assistant professor, so this is a long time ago, 1986. So I actually did my dissertation on organizational death in Michigan, because I was living in Michigan during at least what looked like the most severe downturn in history then, but I guess it's gotten worse. But I wasn't looking at what caused organizational death, rather the way that the process unfolded. And I did like 8 case studies for my dissertation, and I read in the San Francisco Chronicle that a large bank, I won't use the name, but there's only so many large banks, was going to close 125 branches in the state of California. So I got all excited, I contacted them, I drove up to San Francisco and I met with these folks, and they called themselves the Rat Patrol. They were the retail action team, and they were overseeing and managing the closing process for these 125 branches. And so as part of forming the relationship, before they give me the quantitative data, what they did was they sent me out to do case studies. So I did 4 case studies of closings they labeled as successful, and 4 of ones that they labeled as being failures. So success was based, and failure was based largely on how many accounts they retained after a branch closed. So in the branches that were successful, there was almost always the same story, which was they ignored the Rat Patrol. And one of my favorite sort of stories, and I still remember this was in a branch in San Jose. So the branch manager shows me this big sort of book of procedures and so on, and he says, this is the rat patrol procedures, and the secret to my success is I have ignored everything inside this book. So that sort of notion that he was protecting from idiocy from on high. In contrast, as you can guess the rest of the story, that in bad closings, you'd hear all this frustration. They tried to follow the rat patrol procedures, but it just sort of got in the way and made things impossible. So in this case, you got the good branch managers realized that it was their job to protect their folks from idiocy from on high. Two other footnotes. The first one is something that I guess would still happen. When I went to San Francisco and reported my initial findings, I guess what I did, and maybe I shouldn't have done this, but I did do it, I sort of summarized it in the first minute or two of the meeting. Very quickly, all the senior people in the room walked out. There's about 6 of them, and they left me with the most junior guy who escorted me to the elevator, sort of like a sign that when you break bad news, they don't like you, right? And then the other thing, and this just happened, I gave a version of this talk at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco about 10 days ago. And so a guy walks up to me. So I was like signing books. This guy walks up to me and he says, I just want to tell you I was on the rat patrol. And so I got a guy who, oh no, he's going to nail me. And then after a long pause, he says, it was the most screwed up thing I've ever been involved in my life. So I was like, what's a convergent validity? Okay, so let me do my parting thought, and I'm within a minute of your time, Stephen. Let me do my parting thought. One other literature that you should probably know about if you're a boss or you have one is research on energizers. This is done by Rob Cross at the University of Virginia. He's done this in more than 50 companies, and to give you the sort of short version, one of the things he finds over and over again is that bosses who are most successful in terms of getting good performance reviews, getting promotions, and also being surrounded by people who are energized and innovative. There's this one question he asks when he does the network analysis, a simple yes/no question, which is, after you talk to this person, do you have more or less energy? And I just think of the people I know, to be positive, I think of like David Kelly, I've already mentioned, or our Dean Jim Plummer. Whenever I talk to them, I actually always feel better and more energized afterwards. And there's other people I won't name who, after I talk to them, I just always feel like I want to go take a nap or something. And it is one of those very powerful things. So as a boss, you might want to think about what kind of effect you're having on people. And in looking for a boss, you might want to keep this in mind because it's a sign whether you're latching on to a winner or a loser. So here's my 2 diagnostic questions on the back, but let's move to comments and questions. So we've got 9 minutes. Is that correct, Stephen? So I've been ranting at you for a while. Comments, questions, reactions? Yes?
Is it important for a manager to be able to relate to what the subordinates are doing? There's a lot of tech companies now being run by engineers.
Well, I think there's 2 parts of relating. One is whether or not they can understand the work they do. And when you look at tech companies, it's pretty interesting. If we look at the successful ones, a characteristic of people who run them is independently of whether or not I think they're a jerk, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, the degree to which having people in senior management who actually understand how the work that people do, almost is associated. Well, you start out with Apple. Certainly Jobs understands what's going on. Larry Ellison, not my favorite person on earth, but he does understand what people are doing. He's been the company from the beginning. Steve Ballmer, not exactly my favorite guy either, but you can't argue he doesn't understand what's going on in Microsoft. And if we go to, George Zimmer in the Men's Warehouse, that's non-tech. I mean, he's in the stores all the time. His father was in the business. He understands the business. So, and if you do the counter examples, I mean, that was one of Carly Farina's problems, is that she really did not understand what was going on at HP. And just viewed herself as the grand CEO, to diss Carly Farina, but all the evidence is she was not a great CEO, and why somebody would run on a record where she has failed and say, I could defend Meg Whitman more if I was going to be Republican. But there is, because Meg, it was there from the beginning and understood the business. So I think there's a lot of evidence that when you're in charge of something, you damn well better understand it or get out of the way. And I think that's what good CEOs do who come from other places who don't understand the work, is they actually put people on their top management team who they listen to who know what's going on. But boy, not knowing what you're managing is a big problem. Well, Terry Simmel from Yahoo is sort of like Exhibit 1. Talk about a guy who helped screw up a company, he didn't understand the business. Oh, the counterexample. Yeah?
Is and if how being a good boss, bad boss, different to being a university professor supervising students?
Well, I think it's probably a similar sort of thing, because what you want is to, if we're talking about doctoral students, what you want is an advisor who is actually competent in the field and has connections and doesn't treat you like dirt and steal all your ideas and take credit for them. So at the most basic level, I think that it actually works. I do think that being a university professor is easier than being a real boss in a real organization, though, since I'm married to a real boss in a real organization, especially if you're tenured, because, you know, there's only so much they can do to you. But the fact is, the kind of people who are popular advisor, people who are good and they're famous in the field and who treat their students well. And also, if you're talking about doctoral students, that's when I have students who get job offers as assistant professors, I tend to tell them, don't pay too much attention to the prestige of the institution. Look to see the fate of the average assistant professor who starts there. Do most of them get tenure? Do most of them have good experiences? What happens to their publication record? So it comes to picking your context too. But to go back to what a good leader of other human beings is, this goes back 3,000-4,000 years, is the person competent and are they benevolent? I think it doesn't work too bad for a dissertation advisor, actually. Let's see, fellow right here.
Is there an impact on the work culture, on the quality of management? Is something you pick up from your manager and everyone else around you?
Oh yeah, well yeah.
Is a bad manager, then do you tend to become a bad
Yeah,
manager?
well, in general, yeah. I mean, organizations that are good at breeding and good managers, because since everybody around you models the right behavior, they're good. And there's also more subtlety than that. I mean, there's some places where people are good, but the definition of good is you're tough and sort of like overbearing. If anybody's ever worked in the financial services industry, you can get some of that, especially on Wall Street. And there's other places, I think of sort of Pixar, which is sort of warm and fuzzy. So there's also the definition of a good manager and what's the socially appropriate sort of emotional veneer is also something that you'll pick up from organization to organization. Yeah.
So I love all the stuff that you're talking about, and it's great to actually be able to observe it from outside and see what's the right way of doing something. But when you're in a situation, it's hard to have the level of reflection to actually realize that you're doing something wrong. So I'm wondering if you either have any tips or if you have any work planned on how do you actually internalize some of these things so that you can...
Well, so this is very impressive. First of all, to this point, so to me this goes with self-awareness. And the first thing is, you know, even though each one of us is special and brilliant in our own ways, in general, our assumption as human beings should be that we have much less self-awareness than we actually believe. And along those lines, there's great research on self-awareness. And if you just put this in Google, you can get the PDF. There's a paper called Unskilled and Unaware of It. It's an old journal of personality and social psychology argument paper, and there's a lot of subsequent research. Essentially, the more incompetent people are at something, the more they overestimate their skills. And the one group that tends to not overestimate their skills across a bunch of different kinds of skills are people who are really, really skilled. So it's sort of complicated. And to your point, the best you can hope for when you're in a situation like this is to have people who tell you the truth. So that's what good thing that peers are for. And especially as you move into more senior management, you look at people who are good and people who are bad. The good people tend to have quite good mentors. Senior mentor is somebody they pick up along the way. In Silicon Valley, probably the most famous mentor is Bill Campbell. They say the name Bill Campbell. Randy Commissar sometimes teaches here. Steve Jobs, the whole Intuit top management team. So you need to have somebody like that. And the other thing, I speak for myself, despite my many foibles, and I can occasionally be an asshole, I wrote a book partly from personal knowledge, that having colleagues or peers who can tell you when you're being a jerk is really important. So I've got a few in my department, and it's pretty good having people who straighten me out when I've blown it throughout my life. So having people who can tell you the truth behind closed doors is really important. But some people are good at listening to that stuff, and other folks are bad at listening to that stuff. One of my metrics that I use when I'm sort of like looking whether bosses are good or bad is whether or not they've ever admitted a mistake. And there's some of my colleagues at Stanford, I've been colleagues for 25 years, they have never admitted ever making a single mistake. This is not a good sign. Somebody like that should not be in a management position. But then there's some people who lack enough confidence, are always talking about how much they screw up. You don't want that either, so there's a middle ground. But to me, the best we can do is surround ourselves with people who tell us the truth. And you always have to assume that you're deluding yourself a little bit, because most human beings give ourselves too much credit and have a little bit of hubris. sort of especially if you have good mental health, by the way. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Have you seen any recurring patterns by which supervisees help improve the management?
That's good. So, this is one of the things I wonder if anybody has seen. So one of the books I think about writing next, I have no idea what I'm going to write next. I have some idea what my next book is, but the book after that is like on managing bosses. And there's, if you look at it, there's a big difference between bosses, subordinates who sort of get ahead because they do all that ass-kissing sort of stuff. And I think probably what the best subordinates do is they find ways to give their bosses negative feedback in such a way that they don't come across as jerks. And that's something I'm frankly not very good at, I'm not very good at being subtle. But I sort of think of, there's someone in our department, Ron Howard, does anybody know Ron Howard? He teaches a lot of classes, allegedly the founder of modern decision analysis. Ron can tell you you're screwing up in such a way that makes you love him even more. And if you can develop that ability, I think you will have more effective bosses. But that requires a lot of interpersonal skill. It must be 2:05. They're leaving. I've been to a Stanford class before. Okay, so can we stop?
One more question.
Okay, last question. We'll do it quick because they're leaving. Yes.
Right. Mine was on genders, basically. So when you were talking about the constructive arguing, it made me wonder: have you ever noticed any sort of gender issues in?
Okay, so the gender issue. So to back up, this is going to be longer than I hope, but it's still an important answer. So one of the titles we also got from Mark Hirschhorn for this book was "Top Dog on a Tightrope," because we're describing bosses doing sort of a balancing act. So this comes to arguing and everything else when you're a female boss. In the research on the difference between male and female bosses is there actually isn't that big a difference between what they actually do, but there's a difference in perception that both women and men tend to view female bosses as either, to use the words, a bitch or a doormat. And so being a perfectly assertive male boss is much easier than being a perfectly assertive female boss. And so the reason I brought this up is when I told my wife, who is first led a large law firm and now is CEO of the Northern California Girl Scouts, is that she said, well, you could call it top dog on a tightrope. That would be for women. You guys get a balance beam. And so that's one of the problems. And by the way, the advice I always, after thinking about this for years, the advice I always give women bosses is, you have a choice of erring on the bitch side or the doormat side, err on the bitch side. Because at least if you're a bitch, you get viewed as being competent. And I hate to say it, and this does get at some of the inherent sexism that's in society, and both men and women have this perception. So when it comes to arguing, to answer your point, the chance you're going to be viewed as argumentative, where a guy would just be viewed as sort of like a tough guy who was competent, it's harder being a female boss. And I do think that this effect is something that those of us in society have to work on and sort of check our own sexism when we realize we're doing it, and that goes for both men and women. But there's some research to support this, and talk to female executives. They'll tell you about the bitch doormat problem. All right, so I got to stop, right? All right, thanks, Stephen. All right.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.